Welcome back to Contemporary American Society, Causes and Consequences of Persecution in the United States. Today we're going to discuss persecution based on political opinion in the 20th and 21st centuries. Political persecution happens when the government controls citizens by force and takes away their civil liberties. And it's done for political reasons, in order to achieve political goals. It often happens because of fears about national security. Civil liberties are guarantees and freedoms given to the people by governments. Let's watch a video about a debate, that is a discussion between two people who have different beliefs. Here we see a political debate between a naval officer with top secret clearance, working in the Department of Homeland Security, who's also a Muslim, and a person from the National Security Institute who believes the government should be able to surveil all Americans. Surveillance refers to watching a person closely.
I'm a naval officer who had a top secret clearance in the Bush administration. I'm a naval officer who had a top secret clearance in the Bush administration working at the Department of Homeland Security, and it happened to me. So it can happen to you.
There are two broad categories of government surveillance. The first category relates to criminal surveillance, and that's the mechanism by which federal prosecutors obtain authority from courts to operate a wiretap on a telephone line or to surveil an email account, and that's all related to having probable cause to believe that that individual is engaged in criminal activity. There's a second category of surveillance that relates to the collection of foreign intelligence, and that is much more of a national security tool. It's governed by what's known as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which has been amended many times. That's another category of surveillance in which agents of foreign powers or foreign powers are surveilled to collect foreign intelligence information for use by the U.S. government.
Almost everything we do is sort of now potentially surveillable, which I think is, in a sense, the most important structural change in society. It used to be that if you read a book, if you had a conversation, made a visit to a friend, these were all facts about your life that would not leave a permanent record. Macro change is a shift toward, in a sense, everything being privately surveilled and therefore ready for government acquisition.
I think that the public is going
Official leaks that revealed the massive scale of U.S. surveillance has unmasked it himself.
That spell out a secret surveillance program.
Edward Snowden.
My name is Faisal Gill. I'm an attorney. So when Glenn Greenwald called me, I was in private practice. My office was in D.C., but at that time, I was living in Burlington, Vermont. He wanted to schedule a meeting to meet, and I was at that time just trying to build up my practice. I knew of Glenn Greenwald because I had read the newspaper articles and everything that came out about Edward Snowden, but I did not know him personally. So I went to New York and we met at a hotel, and at that time Glenn Greenwald asked if my email address was what my email address was. He read that to me. He goes, "Is this your email address?" I said, "Yes, it is." And then he said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but you've been under surveillance by the NSA since 2006. And then I asked him, well, how do you know the NSA was spying on me? And then he basically said, well, the documents that Edward Snowden took, your email, if this is your email address, this is the email address that NSA was spying on. And I think I asked him also, were there any other people being spied on, or was it just me? And then he said there was a few other prominent Muslims that were being spied on along with me. You know, before this happened to me, when people would ask me, hey, do you think minorities are picked on more? I would always say, absolutely not. That's just complete nonsense. But now, as I look at the statistics, I absolutely think that that is the case. The reason the NSA was spying on me is because of my religion and because of the fact that I'm active in Muslim issues.
The principal basis for FISA surveillance authority is you've got to have probable cause. I think the important thing to remember, particularly and that's all related to having probable cause to believe that that individual is engaged in criminal activity. There's a second category of surveillance that relates to the collection of foreign intelligence. And that is much more of a national security tool. It's governed by what's known as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which has been amended many times. That's another category of surveillance in which agents of foreign powers or foreign powers are surveilled to collect foreign intelligence information for use by the U.S. government.
Almost everything we do is sort of now potentially surveillable, which I think is, in a sense, the most important structural change in society. It used to be that if you read a book, if you had a conversation, made a visit to a friend, these were all facts about your life that would not leave a permanent record. Macro change is a shift toward, in a sense, everything being privately surveilled and therefore ready for government acquisition.
I think that the public knows
Official leaks that revealed the massive scale of U.S. surveillance has unmasked it himself.
That spell out a secret surveillance program.
Edward Snowden.
My name is Faisal Gill. I'm an attorney. So when Glenn Greenwald called me, I was in private practice. My office was in DC, but at that time I was living in Burlington, Vermont. He wanted to schedule a meeting to meet, and I was at that time just trying to build up my practice. I knew of Glenn Greenwald because I had read the newspaper articles and everything that came out about Edward Snowden, but I did not know him personally. So I went to New York and we met at a hotel. And at that time, Glenn Greenwald asked if my email address was what my email address was. He read that to me. He goes, "Is this your email address?" I said, "Yes, it is." And then he said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but you've been under surveillance by the NSA since 2006. And then I asked him, "Well, how do you know the NSA was spying on me?" And then he basically said, "Well, the documents that Edward Snowden took, your email, if this is your email address, this is the email address that NSA was spying on." And I think I asked him also, were there any other people being spied on, or was it just me? And then he said there was a few other prominent Muslims that were being spied on along with me. You know, before this happened to me, when people would ask me, hey, do you think minorities are picked on more? I would always say, absolutely not. That's just complete nonsense. But now, as I look at the statistics, I absolutely think that that is the case. The reason the NSA was spying on me is because of my religion and because of the fact that I'm active in Muslim issues.
The principal basis for FISA surveillance authority is you've got to have probable cause. I think the important thing to remember, particularly with U.S. persons, is you cannot solely get surveillance authority on a U.S. person because of First Amendment activity. So in other words, if I routinely meet with known terrorism suspects or known intelligence of officials of a foreign country, my meeting with them alone is not sufficient to get authority because that's First Amendment association activity. But there's got to be other evidence that the FBI can present to the court that demonstrates why it's appropriate to surveil me.
None of those happen to me. I don't deal with any foreign governments. I don't associate with any known terrorists. In my mind, I'm thinking, what am I doing? What have I done that would warrant this level of scrutiny, warrant being spied on? And I've heard people talk about in my case, well, what are you worried about if you're not doing anything wrong? So what? They surveilled you, they found nothing, but so what? And I sit there and go, that's not the criteria of our justice system. If that's the case, throw out the Fourth Amendment. There, you cannot have unreasonable searches.
I think given the very robust oversight we have both internally at the FBI and the DOJ, the oversight we have from 4 committees on the Hill, the oversight you have from the PCLOB, there's a significant amount of scrutiny. I don't worry about the intentions or the goodwill of the men and women that run these processes. And to the extent that they're making mistakes, there's a robust system that allows for the detection and correction of those mistakes.
An important thing to remember is what happened to me was not just me. NSA was surveilling about 100 prominent Muslims in the United States. So, and none of us are charged, and that's a very important fact right there. If we're being surveilled, none of us are charged. Forget about even being indicted, or forget about even being convicted.
You see a pattern of justifications for surveillance being offered that make extraordinary claims of necessity, extraordinary claims about the value of some more intrusive or very broad-based surveillance. And then much more quietly years later, it turns out that those claims are just not true. When the NSA was sort of caught doing bulk telephone record surveillance, claims were made about the thousands or tens of thousands of lives that had been saved by this. And then later it turned out, really literally, no useful intelligence came out of that.
The thing that can happen is either you target someone that shouldn't have been targeted, you're overly broad in your targeting of them. You collect information that is beyond the bounds of that's unrelated to foreign intelligence. And the typical ways that you correct for that is you destroy the information. So it may be that if you're legitimately up on a target, you're legitimately surveilling someone, and you collect information that is not related to foreign intelligence, there are things called minimization procedures, which means the recordings of those phone calls or that email information or whatever it may be, it's destroyed.
So it's just important to recognize that there is a persistent pattern in debates about surveillance of very dramatic claims about security benefits being made for programs that turn out to have little or no benefit. So the claim that we're doing this in order to protect against terrorism, in order to safeguard national security, should not be taken to mean it actually does anything.
I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of is that as we get farther and farther away from the events of 9/11, we could get lulled into the assumption that we don't need these surveillance authorities anymore, or they're not meaningful to our protection and our safety, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. And so I think as we debate these issues, it's really important for us to keep in mind exactly the kind of intelligence and information they provide the government so it can take steps to prevent those kinds of horrific events. And also to keep in mind that the government is constantly thinking about how does it execute these authorities while still maintaining compliance and adherence to Fourth Amendment, civil liberties rights, and all the other laws and regulations with which it must comply.
When you're being presented by a fax from law enforcement and they're putting together affidavits, and then you have a U.S. attorney basically really advocating, and U.S. attorneys are very smart and they're skilled in advocating. If you're a jurist, you're being told, okay, look, I got 3-4 law enforcement agencies telling me that this person might be committing the next big terrorist act that could lead to, deaths of hundreds, if not thousands of Americans. On the other side, all I got to do is just give them this warrant, and they'll figure out whether this person is doing anything bad. And if that person is doing anything bad, they can stop them. What would you do? I mean, if I put myself in that situation, I don't know if I wouldn't grant the FISA warrant.
The FISA court has the ability to order the government to cut it out if they think the government is doing something wrong. But a pattern we've seen in recent years is what they call compliance incidents, cases where the government is operating a surveillance program in a way that is not consistent with what the court ordered them to do. And very often, you'll see a ruling where this is finally reported to the court after 3 or 5 or more years, where it'll say, well, okay, for this very long period of time, we have been operating contrary to what the court ordered or what the law requires, impacting often, many thousands or millions of communications and individuals. The inspectors general are there to, among other things, ensure the agencies are complying with the law. That can't be everywhere within an agency like NSA with tens of thousands of employees, with many, many, many different code word classified, extremely complex surveillance programs.
Our system is built on the adversarial system, right? You have a prosecutor, you have a defense attorney, and both are basically advocating their positions to a judge. In this system, there is no other side. There's just one side advocating, here's all the stuff. So those 2 points are very, very big in my opinion, and I think are lacking here.
The most important thing we can do at a structural level is resist the growing demands for bans on strong encryption. For a lot of sometimes good reasons, law enforcement would love to be able to guarantee that they can read anyone's communications if they get a warrant, that nobody can render their data unreadable to the government.
Well, I think there's a healthy skepticism over government surveillance. I don't think anyone wants to live in a police state. You know, we know what life was like under the Stasi in East Germany, and that was not a happy life for those people living in East Germany. And so I think there's a healthy skepticism of it, and I think that's why there's such scrutiny of it. So I think people understand that it's necessary and it's needed, but it's got to be tailored and appropriate for the threat we're facing.
But if you are concerned about the shift from traditional particularized individual surveillance to potential population scale surveillance, a kind of automated monitoring of the population as a whole, then I think it's essential to essentially create technical barriers to that kind of data collection. Because if the architecture makes it possible, it seems almost inevitable that that will happen.
I think that's how some people like to frame it. So they like to create a binary sort of analysis where you either have security or you have civil liberty. I don't agree with that. I think you can have both. My view is you can't have much in the way of civil liberties if the nation isn't secure. And there's also, I think, a well-constructed system for oversight and correction as needed. There are so many actors in this process of government surveillance, whether you're talking about the intelligence community, the judges that approve the authority, the House and Senate that oversee the use of that authority. I think there is very robust accountability and oversight that is given to make sure that these authorities are not abused.
For a FISA court to have 98% of the warrants granted, that's ridiculous. And then I would ask, where is the check and balance?
Ultimately, the safeguard, the accountability for all this, it does fall on the shoulders of voters.
In American history, there have been times when the government has tolerated political debate. At times, people could speak safely about any political idea, but at other times, it wasn't safe to disagree with certain generally accepted ideas. The Red Scare refers to a time when many Americans were afraid the communists in the United States were trying to destroy US society and the power of the US government. The first Red Scare happened in the US between 1917 and 1920 at the end of World War I, when the Communist Party was growing and becoming more important in Russia. Many Americans believed that communism was threatening American society. The second Red Scare started right after the end of World War II and lasted from 1947 until 1957. It caused fear, and there was a lot of propaganda about the threat of communism in America. The first Red Scare that happened at the end of World War I, when Americans were feeling very patriotic. They were afraid that anything could change their lives. Patriotism refers to giving a lot of support to a person's country. Many Americans were against immigration to the US because they were afraid that immigrants would change their lives. The second Red Scare was caused by feelings of tremendous patriotism as well. And because of their patriotism, Americans wanted to protect themselves from anything that was critical of American society. At the start of the Cold War, a time of tension between the US and the Soviet Union that started after World War II, many Americans believed that communism was trying to fill every part of their lives. The threat of a nuclear war contributed to those fears. Senator Joe McCarthy was the leader of what was known as McCarthyism. McCarthyism referred to trying to decrease the threat of communism by persecuting people thought to be a security threat to the US, or whom they believed were not loyal to the US. Although the people that believed in McCarthyism didn't have any evidence. They didn't have proof. McCarthyism was spread through propaganda that caused Americans to believe that communists were soon going to take control of the US. Let's watch a short video about McCarthyism.
Imagine that one day you're summoned before a government panel. Even though you haven't committed any crime or been formally charged with one, you are repeatedly questioned about your political views, accused of disloyalty, and asked to incriminate your friends and associates. If you don't cooperate, you risk jail or losing your job. This is exactly what happened in the United States in the 1950s as part of a campaign to expose suspected communists. Named after its most notorious practitioner, the phenomenon known as McCarthyism destroyed thousands of lives and careers. For over a decade, American political leaders trampled democratic freedoms in the name of protecting them. During the 1930s and 1940s, there had been an active but small communist party in the United States. Its record was mixed. While it played crucial roles in wider progressive struggles for labor and civil rights, it also supported the Soviet Union. From the start, the American Communist Party faced attacks from conservatives and business leaders, as well as from liberals who criticized its ties to the oppressive Soviet regime. During World War II, when the USA and USSR were allied against Hitler, some American communists actually spied for the Russians. When the Cold War escalated and this espionage became known, domestic communism came to be seen as a threat to national security. But the attempt to eliminate that threat soon turned into the longest-lasting and most widespread episode of political repression in American history. Spurred on by a network of bureaucrats, politicians, journalists, and businessmen, the campaign wildly exaggerated the danger of communist subversion. The people behind it harassed anyone suspected of holding left-of-center political views or associating with those who did. If you hung modern art on your walls, had a multiracial social circle, or signed petitions against nuclear weapons, you might just have been a communist. Starting in the late 1940s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the resources of his agency to hunt down such supposed communists and eliminate them from any position of influence within American society. And the narrow criteria that Hoover and his allies used to screen federal employees spread to the rest of the country. Soon, Hollywood studios, universities, car manufacturers, and thousands of other public and private employers were imposing the same political tests on the men and women who worked for them. Meanwhile, Congress conducted its own witch hunt, subpoenaing hundreds of people to testify before investigative bodies like the House Un-American Activities Committee. If they refused to cooperate, they could be jailed for contempt, or, more commonly, fired and blacklisted. Ambitious politicians like Richard Nixon, and Joseph McCarthy used such hearings as a partisan weapon, accusing Democrats of being soft on communism and deliberately losing China to the communist bloc. McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, became notorious by flaunting ever-changing lists of alleged communists within the State Department. Egged on by other politicians, he continued to make outrageous accusations while distorting or fabricating evidence. Many citizens reviled McCarthy, while others praised him. And when the Korean War broke out, McCarthy seemed vindicated. Once he became chair of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in 1953, McCarthy's recklessness increased. It was his investigation of the Army that finally turned public opinion against him and diminished his power. McCarthy's colleagues in the Senate censured him, and he died less than 3 years later, probably from alcoholism. McCarthyism ended as well. It had ruined hundreds, if not thousands, of lives and drastically narrowed the American political spectrum. Its damage to democratic institutions would be long-lasting. In all likelihood, there were both Democrats and Republicans who knew that the anti-communist purges were deeply unjust, but feared that directly opposing them would hurt their careers. Even the Supreme Court failed to stop the witch hunt, condoning serious violations of constitutional rights in the name of national security. Was domestic communism an actual threat to the American government? Perhaps, though a small one. But the reaction to it was so extreme that it caused far more damage than the threat itself. And if new demagogues appeared in uncertain times to attack unpopular minorities in the name of patriotism, could it all happen again?
Many Americans were afraid of being accused of being a communist, so they strictly supported American values. McCarthy investigated people who worked for the government, actors, actresses, professors, and the general public. He fought to identify and eliminate, to get rid of communists. The idea that was that you could find communists anywhere, caused the US government to change policy both internationally and in the US. The Truman Doctrine was created by President Harry Truman. Truman wanted to protect the country from communists. He believed that communists were trying to make the US government less powerful. Anti-communist groups like the House Un-American Activities Committee, known by its initials as HWAC, became important. But Senator McCarthy took the issue even further. He attacked people in the US that he believed might be communists. He even attacked the US Army, and then he attacked President Truman himself. He attacked artists, musicians, writers. He said that they all worked in communist organizations or belonged to the Communist Party of America. He even attacked regular citizens without evidence. Many lost their jobs, or their family and friends didn't want to be associated with them. Others were treated like criminals by law enforcement. That is, the people responsible for making sure that people follow the law. Many actors and actresses in Hollywood were no longer allowed to work if they were accused of being communists. Anyone who didn't seem to have American values was persecuted. Persecution based on political opinion was also carried out by the US Federal Bureau of Investigation, known as the FBI. COINTELPRO took place in the US between 1956 and 1971. You may recall that we discussed COINTELPRO before. It was a series of illegal projects carried out by the FBI that tried to destroy American political organizations. COINTELPRO targeted groups and individuals the FBI thought were threatening the US, including women's groups, the US Communist Party, people who were against the Vietnam War, people who fought for civil rights, like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and even environmentalists and animal rights groups. COINTELPRO was finally exposed in 1971 when files were stolen from an FBI office in Philadelphia. The files proved that the FBI was spying on thousands of Americans. No one knew who stole the files until just 8 years ago. They included a taxi driver, a daycare director, and 2 professors. Let's watch a video in which you're going to meet 3 of the people who stole the files.
It's the greatest heist you've never heard of, and one of the most important.
Last March, someone broke into the FBI offices in Media, Pennsylvania, stole some records, and mailed copies of them around to several newspapers.
Those records would help bring an end to J. Edgar Hoover's secret activities within the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
He ordered his agents not only to expose New Left groups, but to take action against them to neutralize them.
Many Americans were tapped and bugged, had their mail opened by the CIA and the FBI.
The burglars were never caught, and the details have remained a mystery until now. A new book, The Burglary, reveals for the first time who did it and how they used a crowbar to pry open one of the best-kept and darkest secrets in American history.
We were early whistleblowers before whistleblowers were known as such.
The burglars are stepping out of the shadows just as new revelations about secret intelligence operations have many people asking, how much is too much when personal privacy is at stake? In the spring of 1970, the war in Vietnam was raging.
American battle deaths in Vietnam now number 40,142.
And at home, anti-war protesters and law enforcement officers were violently clashing.
It felt like a nightmare was unfolding. I took what was outrage and horror about what was going on, and I realized that I had to take it somewhere.
Bonnie Raines worked at a daycare center in Philadelphia. Her husband, John, taught religion at Temple University. They were the very picture of a golden couple.
We had an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old. We were family folks who also wanted to keep another track active in our lives, which was political activism.
That activism attracted the attention of the FBI. Its director, the powerful and feared J. Edgar Hoover, perceived the anti-war movement, which ranged from radical revolutionaries to peaceful protesters, as a threat to national security.
At one rally, I had one of my children on my back, and not only did they take my picture, but they took her picture.
Protesters like the Raines became increasingly convinced the FBI was conducting a covert campaign against them, tapping their phones and infiltrating anti-war groups.
We knew the FBI was systematically trying to squash dissent, and dissent is the lifeblood of democracy.
Determined to get proof the FBI was crossing the line, fellow activist and Haverford physics professor William Davidon hatched a plan. He reached out to the Raines and 6 others, including a social worker, a graduate student, and a taxi driver named Keith Forsyth.
We agreed to meet someplace where we could talk. And he says, what would you think about the idea of breaking into an FBI office? And I look at him and I'm like, you're serious, aren't you? I was pretty vehement in my opposition to the war, and I felt like marching up and down the street with a sign was not cutting it anymore. And it was like, okay, time to kick it up a notch.
The crew decided to break into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania.
Once I got over the shock of thinking that this was the nuttiest thing I'd ever heard in my life, I'm like, this is a great idea, because we're not going to make any allegations. We're going to take their own paperwork signed by their own people, including J. Edgar Hoover, and give it to the newspapers. So let's see you argue with that.
In the Raines' third-floor attic, the team divvied up responsibilities and assigned tasks. They hung maps to learn about the neighborhood, planned escape routes, and they took extensive notes on the comings and goings in the building.
I signed up for a correspondence course in locksmithing. That was my job, to get us in the door. Practice several times a week. After a month, you get pretty good.
Bonnie was assigned the job of going inside and casing the office.
I was to call the office and make an appointment as a Swarthmore student, doing research on opportunities for women in the FBI. So they gave me an appointment. I tried to disguise myself as best I could, and I went to say goodbye, and I acted confused about where the door was, and that gave me a chance then to check out both rooms and know where the file cabinets were.
Bonnie discovered there was no alarm system and no security guards. She also found a second door leading inside.
When she came back with that news, we became convinced, yes, I think we can get this done. We had more to lose than anybody else in the group because we had these kids.
We faced the reality of if we were arrested and on trial, we would be in prison for very many years. We had to make some plans for that.
With a solid understanding of how they would conduct the break-in, they now needed to figure out when.
March 8th, 1971, Fraser and Ali were fighting for the championship of the world. And we had the feeling that maybe the cops might be a little bit distracted.
While the crew waited at a nearby hotel, Forsyth arrived at the office alone.
Pull up, walk up to the door, and one of the locks is a cylinder tumbler lock, not a pin tumbler lock. And I just about had a heart attack. Bottom line is I could not pick that lock.
They almost called it off, but that second door that Bonnie noticed gave them another chance.
At that point, you know that you're going to have to wing it. Knelt down on the floor, picked the lock in like 20 seconds. There was a deadbolt on the other side. I had a pry bar with me, a short crowbar. I put the bar in there and yanked that sucker. At one point, I heard a noise inside the office. And I'm like, are they in there waiting for me? Basically said to myself, there's only one way to find out. I'm going in.
Next, the inside crew walked into an empty office wearing business suits and carrying several suitcases. They cleaned out file cabinets and then made their way downstairs to the getaway car and drove off unnoticed. The group reconvened at a farmhouse an hour's drive away and started unpacking.
We were like, oh man, I can't believe this worked. We knew there was going to be some gold in there somewhere.
Each of the 8 of us were sorting files, and all of a sudden you'd hear one of them, oh, look at this one, look.
After several long nights digging for documents that looked the most revealing, the burglars sent copies to journalists, including Washington Post reporter Betty Metzger.
The cover letter was from the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, and the first file that I read was about a group of FBI agents who were told to enhance the paranoia in the anti-war movement and to create an atmosphere that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox.
Attorney General John Mitchell asked the Post not to write about the stolen documents, saying it could endanger lives.
The Attorney General called 2 key editors and tried to convince them not to publish.
But the Post did publish the story on the front page. It was the first of several reports and told how agents turned local police, letter carriers, and switchboard operators into informants.
There were very strong editorials calling for an investigation of the FBI.
Another stolen document would prove even more explosive, a routing slip marked with a mysterious word, COINTELPRO. While reporters tried to uncover its meaning, the FBI was desperate to find the burglars. The Bureau put nearly 200 agents on the investigation. Hoover's best lead was the college girl who had visited their office.
His command was, find me that woman.
Agents actively searched for Bonnie, but there were many anti-war activists who fit her description.
We could hide within thousands of people. There were so many of us who were active.
2 years later, NBC reporter Carl Stern figured out the meaning of that word, COINTELPRO.
Secret FBI memos made public today show that the late J. Edgar Hoover ordered a nationwide campaign to disrupt the activities of the New Left without telling any of his superiors about it.
Many of the techniques were clearly illegal. Burglaries, forged blackmail letters, and threats of violence were used.
The FBI initially defended its actions.
The government would have been derelict in its duty had it not taken measures to protect the fabric of our society.
But the Bureau's techniques were worse, and the targets more far-reaching than the burglars ever imagined.
Diplomats, government employees, sports figures, socially prominent persons, senators, and congressmen.
The FBI at one time sought to blackmail the late Martin Luther King into committing suicide.
Marriages were destroyed, violence was encouraged, many Americans were tapped and bugged, had their mail opened by the CIA and the FBI, and their tax returns used illegally.
Congress issued a series of reforms. When William Webster took over the FBI in 1978, his mandate was clear.
My primary focus was making clear that COINTELPRO was no longer one of the arrows in the quiver of the FBI, that we were out of that business forever.
Webster admits the Bureau's tactics were out of bounds, but does not condone what the activists
There were things happening that were flat out wrong. Ordinary, how you treat your fellow man, wrong. And we took a risk to try to do what we could to put a stop to it.
The burglars were never caught. 5 years later, with the statute of limitations running out, the FBI closed the case, unsolved.
On the very last memo where they say who they think broke into the media office, they're down to 7 people. Only one was, in fact, one of the media burglars.
For nearly 20 years, Betty Metzger had no idea who the burglars were until one night, an old acquaintance she was having dinner with let it slip.
And our youngest daughter, Mary, was there. I said, Mary, you really ought to know Betty, because she was the one that we sent all those documents to. And Betty's chin dropped like that.
I was absolutely stunned.
Metzger spent years tracking down the other burglars and getting them to reveal the secret they had vowed to keep forever. The mastermind, William Davidon, recently died, but he and 4 others are identified in Metzger's book, The Burglary, and in a new documentary, 1971, directed by Johanna Hamilton.
We didn't know this extraordinary story, this seemingly small event that actually had very far-reaching consequences.
The exposure of COINTELPRO pushed Congress to rein in government surveillance. It created a special court, the so-called FISA court, to issue warrants when intelligence agencies want to spy on U.S. citizens. But after 9/11, more wide-ranging surveillance was allowed. Just how much the NSA's spying activities had grown was largely unknown until 2013, when contractor Edward Snowden leaked classified documents.
This is the truth. This is what's happening. The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong.
The U.S. government reportedly attaining top-secret court orders requiring Verizon to turn over the telephone records of millions of Americans to the National Security Agency.
Revelations about the government monitoring phone records and emails have renewed questions about the balance between privacy and security.
I definitely see parallels between Snowden's case and our case. What we revealed changed public opinion, which is why the laws were changed. If revealing ourselves is going to get people arguing with each other about what the FBI did then and what the NSA is doing now, I think that's a good thing.
Today, most Americans believe that the U.S. has political freedom. but the proportion of people who believe that they have political freedom is less than during McCarthyism. Political freedom is related to a person's race, with African Americans believing that they have less freedom than white Americans do. Many African Americans in the US don't feel free to express their political views today. Intolerance is still common in the US today. Most Americans don't believe communists should be allowed to give a speech or have a demonstration. There's less political persecution in the US today than there was when McCarthy was persecuting Americans, but there is still much intolerance. Americans today believe that there is political freedom in the US today, but Americans think that there's less political freedom now than during the Red Scare. Today, Americans feel political intolerance toward many groups, including people in different political parties, not just communists. Some Americans don't tolerate liberals. Others don't tolerate conservatives. The members of religious groups don't feel free, and some communists don't feel free, and some people from other groups don't feel free. Although there is more tolerance today than during McCarthyism. But a lot of Americans don't tolerate people with different ideas than their own ideas. Next week, we're going to discuss persecution on the basis of membership in a social group. Have a great week.